Hi, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us. Happy Sunday. My name is Robert. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. I have to set up a couple of things to get our recording squared away first. And as soon as that's done, which will be momentarily, we'll get started. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Robert. So once again, thanks so much for joining us. This is actually part 9 in a series that Edward, my friend from Georgetown University, has been doing on the history of slavery. If you were not able to join us for the other programs, let me just read off the titles of those. You can find recordings of those on our YouTube channel, and I'll post the links for those in the Zoom chat and the Q&A, and also in the comment section on Facebook. It was also that information with the links for the prior program was included in the Zoom information along with this one. So the previous programs, we started off with Enslaved, the history of Washington, D.C. from 1790 to 2021. Then we had Empire of Blood, Europe from 1554 to 1807. The third part was Slaver Nation, European America from 1495 to Jim Crow. That was followed up by Slavery and the U.S. economy. Then we had Rise, Black resistance from Gabriel's Revolt to George Floyd. White, a race as a theory of history, and the laws of U.S. apartheid. Today's program is going to be a continuation of the series. It's called First Peoples of America and Indigenous Slavery. And with that, I'd like to introduce my good friend Edward, joining us from Washington, D.C. Edward, it's all yours. Take it away. And if anyone has any questions or comments throughout our program, feel free to type those in the chat or the Q&A in Zoom or the comment section on Facebook, and Edward will try and answer as many of those as he can at the end of our program. And this is also being recorded, so if you have to jump off at some point in time, or if you want to watch it again, or if you know anyone else that'll be interested, we'll make the Zoom recording link available at the later on this weekend. Thanks, Ed. Take it away. It's all yours.
Robert, are you doing any kind of introduction?
No, I'll just let you roll with it from here. It's all yours.
All right. Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I do much appreciate your being part of a learning experience. The work we're doing collectively, Robert and those who join us, is a work that's important. Today we're specifically looking at a topic that I think rarely gets any media attention, precisely in the issue of enslavement. And so much of the topic today will be difficult. Much of it might be new. Many of the speakers will surprise people, but it's important that we have this kind of information. Extirpate, to completely destroy and remove. And this is from Jeffrey Amherst, who we know as Amherst, Massachusetts, and the College of Amherst. I trust will destroy their settlements and extirpate them from the country. Jeffrey Amherst, given honor as the founder of Amherst College and also the city of Amherst. The only good Indian is a dead Indian, a quote from General Sheridan, and later, as we will see, from Teddy Roosevelt. The settlers gave a name to the mutilated and bloody corpses they left in the wake of scalp hunts, Redskins. And by the way, the book that I'm quoting here is An Indigenous History of the People of the United States, and I will talk about that a little bit later. Okay. I can neither speak for the dead this afternoon, nor do justice to the people. I can, however, speak to the dead and speak to the functions these people served in our U.S. political imaginary. The presentation might better be thought of as a consideration of the stories we tell and told as a people and probably as individuals in order to anchor an American fantasy that we call democracy and to assuage our guilt, a collective, I think, country guilt over the genocide called Manifest Destiny. These are harsh terms and harsh words, and clearly I have a politic on this, but I do, once one thinks about, once we move away from the narratives that we were giving in high school and college, which, as I have been saying for the last 8 or 9 sessions, with all puns intended, whitewash a complete history for us, which Martin Luther King back in 1963 referred to, as we'll see. So the questions that I'm asking, what are Indians for? And my practice here is I don't use the concept Indian. I have it here in quotes because it's a word that is used and I think it's inappropriate, and we'll talk about that. What is their place in the originary narrative? And by originary narrative, I mean the narrative of the US, the founding, manifest destiny, landing on the East Coast, city on a hill, all of these sorts of things that we have as part of our coming up this week in terms of our Thanksgiving narratives, for example. So a kind of a triumphant notion of how we found an empty land and made it our own. So what is the place of these people there? How has the narrative changed their history, their presence, and removed them actually, in order to render us blameless? And I understand it is difficult because we can say it's like reparations. Well, I didn't do it and I'm not the one who did it, and so how am I an us? Well, we are collectively an us because we embody and keep on with the narratives of the United States. And it's up to us to begin to reflect upon and to rewrite these particular narratives for the next generation as we come through. The United States' obsession with the mythology of the West, the manifest destiny, where a term that was 1848, actually that late, not only robbed indigenous people of their land and homes, but also absolved itself from any wrongdoing. Manifest destiny, you can hear it in the terms. It was like, well, it's when someone says to you, it's perfectly clear that, or it's common knowledge that, we know that probably not common knowledge and it's not perfectly clear. Manifest destiny works the same kind of way.
And I just noticed the slides didn't pop up yet.
This slider in the corner?
Any slides, it's just showing your picture and then my name because I unvideoed myself.
Well, are these showing up?
No, it's just strictly, the only thing that pops up on the screen right now is the video of yourself and myself.
All right. Hold on 1 second. I think I may have to start over. Not over, but see, this is what happens, Robert, when you disappear. I hope we're not having another bad. No, I need to share this, Robert, somehow. Can you see it?
Yeah, is it not coming up at your end?
I don't see the little. Wait a minute.
Here, let me,
Hold on.
maybe I screwed up something at my end. Yeah, you should just be able to share it at the bottom of the screen. Is there a share screen icon if you hold your arrow over the bottom?
No, it's not here. That's okay. Can folks see this? Can you see this?
No, it's just strictly the same thing still. It's just the video images.
I think I need to start over. There we go. All right.
Okay, now something's happening. Okay, there we go.
Okay, where is it?
We're getting warmer. Oh, looks like we're almost there. Oh, now we're really getting warmer. Hey,
Okay.
there we go. Okay, we're perfect. All right, thanks everybody.
All right.
Thanks, Ed.
I think I'm going to move ahead. I did some of this. All right, as we were. A U.S. obsession with the mythology of the West and manifest destiny not only robs indigenous people of their land and homes, but absolves itself from any wrongdoing. If we were to add up all the Indian slaves taken in the New World from the time of Columbus to the end of the 19th century, the figure would run somewhere between 2.5 million and 5 million slaves. So our conception of these first peoples as a nation was not one of slavery, because when we hear the issue and the topic of slavery, generally we specify a specific type and a race type of person. And while that is not incorrect, what is incorrect is that for the first 126 years of European settlement, the primary enslaved persons were first peoples. So our conception of these first peoples was not one of slavery, but of rivalry, a self-serving narrative that supported the myth of Americans, white Americans, as underdogs overcoming the odds. A point that I make, invasion is a structure, not an event. So that we're looking now at as a systematic, I'll say it, invasion of a particular country, which is structured itself in the way of the politicals of the time, and it's not simply one event. And what you see over here on the left side over here is a map of about 30 different language types and 30 different types of indigenous persons. And just very quickly, these are the people we're talking about. In Canada, you have 50 nations, 50 indigenous languages, 1.7 million population. The US recognizes federally 537 tribes with 7 million people. Latin America, 800 different indigenous groups with 45 million population. And you can see the different language groups overlaying all the way from the lower Mesoamerica all the way up through Canada. From the earliest days of the United States in particular, the federal government had not known what to do about Indian tribes. In the first three decisions of the Supreme Court, the first one of these, 1831, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, the Supreme Court rules Indian tribes were not foreign nations, were not states. They were domestic dependent units, nations. And nations is a word that I don't use because I think it's inappropriate, and they will also say this. As nations, Indian tribes were not subject to the laws of states. However, the Constitution of the United States did not provide any guidelines for the dealing with them. And I will include today, even if I don't discuss, the first peoples of the lower Americas. For example, the Aztecs were pre-Columbian Mesoamerican people of Central Mexico, 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. They called themselves Mexica. Canadian First Nations, below in red. This was a recent newspaper article. Canada's High Court sides with First Nations in land rights case. I'm going to bring that up here again because there's going to be a point to which when we talk about First Nations and their legal right to do these kinds of matters, that they do now have a jurisdiction in the States, thank you to King George in 1673. The Canadian Constitution recognizes three groups of Aboriginal peoples: Indians, commonly referred to as First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Three different distinct persons, peoples, unique histories, languages, cultural practices, spiritual beliefs. More than 1.6 million people in Canada identify themselves as Aboriginal. There are more than 630 First Nation communities in Canada, representing more than 50 nations and 50 Indigenous tribes. In the lower Americas, the history of the native peoples of the Americas, Mesoamerican cultures. You can see here too, in green, you have the Mayan civilization, 1800 before Common Era through 900 Common Era, and then later in the orange tan, excuse me, the Aztec Empire from 1245 to 1521 Common Era, covered at its greatest extent most of northern Mesoamerica. Now, I want to point out here, and the reason that I'm taking this segue right at the beginning is just to underterm just how many peoples we are talking about when we speak of indigenous, First Nations, First Peoples, or peoples of the Americas. Yeah. Item. According to Ward Churchill, the reduction of the North American Indian population from an estimated 12 million in 1500 to barely 237,000 in 1900 represents, quote, a vast genocide, the most sustained on record. Item. By the end of the 19th century, quote, the worst human holocaust in the world has ever witnessed, roaring across 2 continents for 4 centuries, consuming the lives of countless tens of millions of people. Item. In the judgment of Lenore Stefan Villain, quote, there can be no more monumental example of sustained genocide, certainly none involving a race of people as broad and complex as this, anywhere in the annals of human history. Andres Resendez, The Other Slavery, The Uncovered Story of Indian Enslavement, is a book that I would recommend to read on this. 2016. Indigenous people were the original test subjects for enslavement, but somehow this fact has been largely ignored by modern history. Give me one pause just for 1 second.
While we're waiting for Ed to return, just mention again, so this is a multi-part series that he's been doing on the history of enslavement in the United States. Ed is a professor at Georgetown University. You can find the recordings of the previous programs on our YouTube channel, which is Washington, D.C. History and Culture. I included the links in the Zoom information that I sent out, the Zoom information for this program, and it was also in the event description for the different programs, and I'll also email it out later on after the end of this program. Okay, Ed, I was just keeping the crowd warm.
That's okay. Thank you for the
It's all yours.
pause. I'm on childcare at the same time.
No problem. Pause whenever you need to.
So we're going to start with a term called settler colonialism. Teddy Roosevelt, referred to as Aguinaldo in the Philippines in 1898 as, quote, a renegade Pawnee, quote, unquote, and observed that Filipinos did not have the right to govern their country just because they happened to occupy it. That is settler colonialism, and we'll talk a bit about that as we go through. So we know the expression colonialism. The logical progression of modern colonialism as we understand it begins with some kind of economic penetration and graduates to a sphere of influence, and then to protectorate status, indirect control, military occupation, and finally annexation. And this is again from the Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. And this is the kind of language that Martin Luther King in 1963 was talking about. And you can see that as we are talking here about the United States and the way of dealing with indigenous peoples of all different races. Okay. So very quickly, settler colonialism is different than colonialism as we understand it, because it seeks to replace the original population of the colonized territory with a new society of settlers. What we call manifest destiny is then a shorthand form of talking about a concept clearly they didn't have then, settler colonialism. In red, some genocidal campaigns were carried out by official military forces of the metropole or the colonies. And I do say I understand that the word genocidal might arouse some questions. Let's just listen to the voices themselves. Well, others were unauthorized actions by settler vigilantes. The attacks launched by vigilantes were likely to be partly brutal, particularly brutal, and to involve slaughtering of women and children and infants and the elderly. In 1609, you note the year, when hostilities broke out between the English settlers and Jamestown and Native Americans in the region, this is a quote, by the way, the leader of the colony, James Smith, quote, pioneered the tradition of irregular warfare in the New World by burning and razing Indian homes and agricultural fields. to note here is the way that the text itself talks about when hostilities broke out between the English settlers and Native Americans. Well, actually, it was sorry, it was the English settlers who prompted the destruction of Powhatan and his daughter and his people themselves. Yeah. Uh, Here are some of the, just quotes. The doom of their civilization, D. Brown, bury my heart at wounded knee. Exterminate or banish, Governor Ramsey, 1870s, Minnesota. I've come to kill Indians and believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. Lieutenant Shivington, former minister, attack and kill every male Indian over 12 years of age. General Connor, the only good Indians I ever saw were dead. Sheridan, General Sheridan, and later Teddy Roosevelt. The nigger, like the Indian, will be eliminated. It is the law of the races and history. Walt Whitman. My idea is that unless removed by the government, they must necessarily be exterminated. Governor Pitkin, Colorado, 1860. The government feeds and clothes and educates your children now, and desires to teach you to become farmers and to civilize you and make you as white men. It's astonishing which one the things that one hears and reads. This is Martin Luther King. A prescient comment, 1963. The United Nations had just used the word genocide in 1948, and it is just now beginning in 1963. Dr. King was the first person to actually think about it and use it conceptually to think about the United States. In Why We Can't Wait, he writes, our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shores, the scars of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. And this, and those who have heard me before understand that this is my only take with 1619 Project from the New York Times, is that they, by beginning with 1619, they eliminate completely any reference to the indigenous enslavement from 1495 through 1619, to which Dr. King refers here. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles of racial supremacy. We are perhaps one of the very few nations which tried as a matter of national policy to wipe its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade, manifest destiny. Indeed, even today, we have not permitted ourselves to reject or to feel remorse for this shameful episode. Our literature, our films, our drama, our folklore, all exalted. And while we may not have time in today's presentation to talk about it, the narrative that we're looking at is exactly the one that I'm talking about. The cowboys and the Indians, the John Wayne, the Western, the former president who says, take them dead or alive, right out of the kind of the Western. In the 1890s, down below, the total population of North American Indian, 400,000, down from 18 to 19 million in 1492. So Dr. King's point at the end about elevating a tragic experience into a crusade, and then even looking at it in terms of a kind of narrative, literature, films, drama, and our folklores. We're going to end this by talking about the expression Geronimo, where we saw that. This part gets a little difficult because this is going to be basically a rewriting or an unwriting of a narrative that we already have. For Europeans, enslavement was part of a larger strategy to depopulate the land and make the way for European settlers. That seems, when you think about it, on the face of it, self-evident that these lands were not empty. Even the Thanksgiving narrative that we have is that there were people living here. As early as 1636, and this is probably maybe 7 years after there was landing, after the Pequot War, in which 300 Pequots were massacred, those who remained were sold into enslavement and sent to Bermuda. This is the kind of narrative that surprises people because one hears that, well, enslavement it's all south and it's not north, and that's just not correct. The North profited in terms of every penny that it made, in terms of the materials of linen, in terms of liquor, in terms of sugar that came out of its manufacturers. That while the South may have been doing some of the work, the North was doing the rest. Many of the indigenous survivors of King Philip's War in 1775, 1675, 76, this is 100 years before what we would call our own, sorry, our own Revolutionary War. But the point of King Philip War was the settlers needed more land. And these were not any settlers, these were New England settlers, largely Rhode Island and Massachusetts, mostly Massachusetts. So Massachusetts, Metacom, Pequots, if you are a New Englander, you know these names. We kept the names and we eliminated the people. Major ports were used for enslavement. The first peoples who were not slain, and we'll see, were used as enslaved. Boston and Salem, Mobile and New Orleans. Indigenous peoples were shipped to Barbados by the English, Martinique, Guadeloupe by the French, Antilles by the Dutch. Enslaved Indians were sent to the Bahamas, quote, as the breaking grounds, where then they might be transported back to New York or to Antigua. Professor Warren's book, New England Bound, is an important one in this. Slavery and Colonization in Early Columbia. This is the first seal of the District of Massachusetts, and from 1620 onward, it was founded with loftier goals than those in Virginia, and it keeps priding itself on being loftier goals because it was designed by the Puritans. But I want you to see here that you have the image on the seal, the first seal, of an indigenous person, and you have here, come over and help us. Well, I'm sure there's some irony here. It was not intended to talk about helping the Native American or the Indian. It was intended to basically help the Puritans do their work. And not every English person who moved to New England was a Puritan, but Puritans dominated politics, religion, and culture of New England. Even after 1700, the region of Puritan inheritance shaped its histories. So in New England, for example, the selling of Indian slaves on the international market in the Caribbean and South America defrayed the costs in the Virginia colony of the Powhatan Wars. Settler men spoke of their desire for Native American women. Now these are the Puritans. These are not anybody else. One of the original settlers to John Winthrop, we know John Winthrop being the city on a hill. He was the one who, the Mayflower Compact, he was the first governor. In 1636, after the Pequot Wars of extermination, one of the settlers writes to John Winthrop, "There is a little squaw that Stuart Collicott desireth. Lieutenant Damford also desireth one, to wit, a tall one with 3 strokes upon her stomach." In the South, quote, "Only through warfare could Carolinians obtain the slaves they desired for the kings to exchange for supplies to build their plantations." So the settlers' text of the first peoples in Massachusetts, this is how they treated it. This is a foundational early text. Anyone here this afternoon who is in American Studies knows William Bradford's History of the Plymouth Plantation. I guarantee you that the section that you're given in school to read is not this section. This is the Pequot Wars. "Those that escaped the fire were slain with the sword. Some hewed to pieces, others were thrown through with the rapers, so as that they were quickly dispatched and very few escaped. It was conceived that they thus destroyed about 400 at this time. A fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire, and the streams of blood quenching the same, and horrible was the stink and scent thereof. But the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave the prayers thereof to God." All right, I'm not going to read the whole thing. So you get my point here in this is we are given a history, and especially at this particular time of Thanksgiving, we had this narrative of Thanksgiving and how we came into a land where there were people here and we helped them and they helped us. The texts don't tell us this. Indeed, Massachusetts Bay Colony was the first slaveholding colony in New England. 1641, Governor John Winthrop, a slave owner himself, came in on the Mayflower, who wrote the Mount of Christian Charity, who Ronald Reagan quotes City on the Hill. He helped write the first law legalizing enslavement in North America, the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, which a general court passed in 1641, 21 years after Mayflower. took land in what's now Provincetown. On the right here, Henry David Thoreau, Slavery in Massachusetts, and I will guarantee you that as much as we know about Henry David Thoreau and however much he's lauded for civil disobedience and the other writings that he has done, probably very few of us know that he wrote about slavery in Massachusetts. And clearly anyone in American studies probably has never given that book to read, because I think there is a systematic refusal to understand this particular narrative. This is a Christian charity model thereof. That's John Winthrop on the left, and that's the narrative on the right of the first Thanksgiving. And you're looking at it, you're going, they don't have that kind of a scenography in number one in Massachusetts on the Cape. But as a matter of fact, it's also the narrative that simply wasn't true, because within 20 years, they had slain all the people in the area around them. Okay. And something else that we don't hear about the Puritans, Tituba was the woman who called out Salem, the witches in Salem. She was originally from the Barbados. She is a slave. You don't ever hear that in the particular narrative. She's owned by Samuel Parris. You don't hear that in the narrative. She'd been a slave since her capture during childhood. He brings her to Massachusetts in 1680 when she was a teenager. So in all of the trials of the several witches in New England, rarely does the narrative of the enslavement part of this ever come through. That the persons who were calling out the Puritans for enslavement, not enslavement, but Salem, were themselves enslaves. The genocide of Indigenous has an even uglier turn. Historians find evidence that millions were shipped overseas in bondage. 2 to 4 million kidnapped, sold in bondage. Research estimates between 1650 and 1730, at least 50,000 Indians were exported to the English colonies alone from Massachusetts, Virginia, and South Carolina to Caribbean ports. The Caribbean itself becomes a market for northern manufacturing. For the vast majority of the slaves were carried to the sugar colonies of the Caribbean and South America. By 1755, more than 13,000 enslaved people were working in New England. This is, again, a fact that we don't pay much attention to. The first recorded New England slave voyage sailed from the city of Boston in 1644. Faneuil Hall in Boston is now the legacy of the man who did the original sails. By 1670, Massachusetts traders were regularly carrying slaves between Africa and the Caribbean. Rhode Island distilleries would catch up themselves. Picture on the left, on the right, Dewworth Distillery in Rhode Island. What's interesting here and tragic is the New England trade that we pay little attention to. Rhode Islanders entered the trade in about 1700, and by 1769, 2/3 of Rhode Island's fleet was engaged in the slave trade from the city of Newport. Over the next century, more than 60% of the North American ships involved in the slave trade were based in Rhode Island. And you can see here from Newport, Africa, Caribbeans. And very often what we're seeing here is that the enslaved indigene from New England were sent to the Barbados, where they would then be sold to the colony, because they weren't kept in New England because they were afraid that they would be able to find their own particular way out. Duke of York. English mercantile trading company set up in 1660 by the Royal Stuart family and the City of London merchants to trade along the west coast of Africa. The Duke of York, we get New York, who was the brother of Charles II, later took the throne as James II. It shipped more African slaves to the Americas than any other company in the history of the Atlantic slave trade. And so in the discussion about changing the names and do we keep the names and what do we do with these particular things, here's a particular point. And here in red, the New York City Council in 1711. City Council passes a law, quote, all Negro and Indian slaves that are allowed to hire be hired at the market house at the Wall Street slip. One can see these now until one can go down and see that particular area. But the law is interesting because it's talking to us not only about Negro, but also Indian slaves. Okay. A little farther down, Powhatan and Jamestown. This is a different politic than New England, possibly, but essentially the same result. And New England has a kind of a self-narrative that says that we were not involved in any of this. We were mostly about theology, and we weren't caring about the kind of agricultural background and fields. What we're seeing is that the north end of enslavement, well, they never took any of the responsibility for it. The northern manufacturers, the northern bankers, the northern insurances, the northern mortgage persons who were basically ensuring that Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, Jefferson couldn't sell his enslaved persons because they were all mortgaged to the property. So here again, you see the Powhatan, and Powhatan says to James, the settlers, why take what we would give you for free? Why take what we would give you for free? And you remember that they kidnapped Pocahontas, took her to England and carried her and called her Rachel. This is the brother of one of the settlers killing the leader of Powhatan when they exterminated the people. Okay. So an overview of how Europe handled the indigenous. Indigenous enslavement became official Spanish policy in 1503. Now remember, this is 11 years after first contact, 8 years after Columbus returned to Spain with, with enslaved Caribbean indigenes. The British colonists in Virginia began immediately upon the settlement at Jamestown in 1607, and a decade later in Massachusetts. If you look from the years 1636 through 1680 in Massachusetts, and just look up any history and see the depredation and extirpation, to use Jeffrey Amherst's expression, of the indigenous persons in that particular state. And where it gets a little harder for some of us to think about, who have not had this kind of background, it was U.S. federal policy as early as Washington, quote, to extirpate the original people of this land if the indigene could not be civilized. We're not used to the older, archaic extirpate. We know it more as exterminate. But this is Commander-in-Chief George Washington, 1779. The expedition you are appointed to command is to be directed against the hostile tribes of the 6 nations of Indians with their associates and adherents. The immediate objects are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements, the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. It will be essential to ruin their crops now to the ground and prevent their planting more. Washington's comment about the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex is reflected again in Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, where he in fact blames this kind of warfare on the indigene. So between 1492 and 1880, and yes, 1880 is beyond, quote, the legal point in the US after the Civil War where enslavement ended, between 2 and 5.5 million indigene of the Eastern Shore were enslaved in the Americas, in addition to 12.5 million African indigenous people. Okay. Another classic and central book to this, and if anyone is interested in tracking the 1619 New York Times project, where essentially it eliminates any of this kind of reference, is to look at Indian slavery in colonial America. The point that the editor makes is that in the fields and homes of the colonial settlements, the intimate relations between African Americans and Native American peoples was forged in their collective oppression. Very often they escaped together. That the enslavement of African indigenous, as it developed, was based upon practices derived already in place in the Caribbean and early in the kind of the Gulf states of the colonies, Gulf colonies, of enslavement of indigenous people of the Americas. as well as from British experience in subjugating Irish clans. Now, that's a different story, and that if you want to have a reference on how the British settlements, how they, in terms of, developed a kind of methodology for dealing with subjugated people, how they first started with the Irish. Enslavement of African indigenes was imposed on a pre-existing system of Indian enslavement. In North America, the two never diverged as distinct institutions. And in advance of my argument here, right now we're simply talking the colonies. So we're not talking the rest of the country, we're going to come to that. George III and the Royal 1673 decree pre-colonies, a text that's important, that we refer to it in the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson refers to it. That first headline about the Canadian courts refers to it, because essentially the Royal 1673 gives the first peoples of the Americas legal status. They did not have that until that particular time. Okay. Oops, sorry. Oh, wait, sorry. We just saw this a moment ago. Jeffrey Amherst, Commander-in-Chief of British Forces in North America, writes as follows to Colonel Bouquet at Fort Pitt, quote, "You will do well to try to inoculate the Indians with smallpox by means of blankets, as well as to try every other method that can serve to extirpate this execrable race." 1763. The year is important. It's the year also that King George has his royal decree, but we're also moving now into the era of what we would call the Revolution. And again, could it not be contrived, Amherst writes to a subordinate, quote, "to send the smallpox among these disaffected tribes of Indians? We must on this occasion use every stratagem in our power to reduce them." And again, elsewhere, Amherst then gives orders, quote, "to bring them to a proper subjection until, quote, there was not an Indian settlement within 1,000 miles of our country." You notice how already in 1763 it is our country. Okay. 1750 through 1777, the French and Indian War would later be seen as the trigger for independence. And there's a lot going on here, so let's take a little bit piece, in which this distinctly American nation was born. The mythology, again, for those who are American studies or had any of this in high school or college, is expressed in the 1826 novel, The Last of the Mohicans, a narrative set in 1757. And you know the book, I don't have to tell you about it, the Leatherstocking Tales, in which the last of the Mohicans basically slumps off to the west and dies. And of course, it's, as soon as the people are gone, we can ennobilize them and call them the noble savages. But in the meantime, they're here and they figure up into our documents like the Declaration of Independence. And so some historians portray the British as the organizers of indigenous resistance. Why? The separatist colonial oligarchy that drew up the Declaration of Independence certainly takes that view. So this is Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. Here you see here the merciless Indian savages. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states. Some background. Jefferson needs these states populated. He buys the Louisiana Purchase for the particular reason, because as a matter of fact, he's a businessman, he's a breeder of slaves, and he makes 4% interest on them. It's his task to move people to the west, and he did everything he could to increase the land in order to do that. That's a different narrative, but so put the Declaration of Independence into context. He's endeavored to prevent the population of these states. For that purposes, raising the conditions of new appropriations of land, meaning that King George's proclamation says, this is the line, on the left side of it is the indigene, the people who live here, on the right side of it is the colonies, and the line went basically through the Appalachian, all the way from Mesoamerica, all the way up through Canada. The Declaration says, endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Well, I think we just saw George Washington saying exactly those things. A little bit of legal history here on the right. The English Royal Proclamation of 1763, and you can see the line all the way from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up through the top of the country. And if you look at it over here, so if you had an image of Canada, you have Northwest, Plateau Plains, East, Subarctic, and Arctic. These are the native peoples at the time of European contact. Just to repeat something, this land was not our land, to quote Robert Frost. It was somebody else's on the land. So the expression that we call Indian country. King George III's Royal Proclamation of 1763 provides an operational definition of Indian country in North America. It sets guidelines for the administration and sovereignty within these tribal lands, and essentially said, to one hand, the colonies here, the rest of this land is their land. Now, as we kind of see, the U.S. feds have passed 500 plus treaties with the Indigenous First Nations and violated every one of them. And that's kind of probably what we're talking about here this afternoon. But the effects of these declarations shaped the evolution of Indian affairs in Canada and the United States. Their influence has endured to this particular day. In 1980, the Supreme Court basically ruled that the Sioux, the treaty against the Sioux at Laramie had been violated, and the Black Mountains, on which stands Mount Rushmore, should be returned. And failing that, they should be awarded $6 billion for that land. The Sioux had never taken the land, never taken the money. They don't want the money, they want the land. The land is theirs by treaty. And the treaty says in Larimer 1763, forever into eternity. So once again, the father of the country has opinions. The expedition you're appointed to command is to be directed against the hostile tribes of the Six Nations. We just read this. The immediate objects are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements, the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. It'll be essential to ruin their crops now in the ground and to prevent their planting more. Jamestown and the province of the Carolinas, the first English settlement. Datum from 1778 to 1871, the United States government entered into more than 500 treaties with the First Peoples tribes. All of these treaties have since been violated in some way or outright broken by the U.S. government. Indigenous and First Nations peoples are still fighting for their treaty rights in federal courts and at the United Nations. And why they can do that? Because King George III, whom some thought was crazy, nonetheless gave them legal sight in law. And by the way, this does not include the colonial treaties. I'm not going to look at all these, but you can kind of see all the treaties that constantly made, 500 of them, over 500 of them. The chief of the Utes in 1868, the agreement an Indian makes to a United States treaty is like the agreement a buffalo makes with the Sunners when pierced with arrows. All they can do is lie down and give in. Andrew Jackson, 1814, led an expedition against the Creek Indians. Jackson's force soundly defeats the Creeks and destroys their military power. He then forces on the Indians a treaty whereby they surrendered to the United States over 20 million acres of their traditional land. One half of present Alabama, 1/5 of Georgia. And over the next decade, Jackson led the way in the Indian removal campaign, helping to negotiate 9 of the living major treaties to remove Indians. Andrew Jackson, by the way, is the statue in front of the White House. Something's going on here. The Indian Removal Act, a direct consequence of the traffic and enslavement. This area over here, these were the Cherokee nations, the Trail Tiers, which moves them from, Andrew Jackson moves these folks out of here. Why does he move these first peoples out of here? Because suddenly they really, suddenly they realized that this lower land here, in terms of after the cotton gin was developed, that cotton now became a profitable enterprise. And so all of this land that had formerly been given to the Cherokee nations and Choctaw and Creek had to be retrieved. They take all of these peoples and they put them here into what we now can look at and see is Oklahoma. Well, that's interesting because then you see what happens. Andrew Jackson, chiefly responsible for the Indian Removal Act, he writes this in 1833. My original convictions upon this subject have been confirmed by the course of events for several years, and experiences every day adding to their strength. By the way, Andrew Jackson was known as the Indian killer. That's how he got his presidency. That these tribes cannot exist surrounded by our settlements and in continual contact with our citizens is certain. Does this echo Thomas Jefferson's memorial and his own works in his own diary when he says that by law, that by nature has made these two races to be free, and then they edited in the memorial, but they cannot live together because one will be killed, one will be exterminated. They have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habit, nor the desire of improvement, which are essential to any favorable change in their condition. Established in the midst of another and a superior race, without appreciating the causes of their inferiority or seeking to control them, they must necessarily yield to the forces of circumstances and ere long disappear. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court rules that the Cherokee Nation was sovereign. This was the next year. According to the decision rendered by Chief Justice Marshall, this meant that Georgia had no rights to enforce state laws in its territory. We will see a surprising echo of that in a slide or two. Andrew Jackson decides not to uphold the ruling. He directs the expulsion of the Cherokee Nation. Last paragraph. Jackson's reaction to the Supreme Court's decision was to support Georgia's efforts to remove the Cherokee. He vows to ignore the Supreme Court's ruling. He says, quote, John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. By the end of his presidency, Jackson had signed into law almost 70 removal treaties, the result of which was to move nearly 50,000 Eastern Indians to Indiana Territory, defined as the region belonging to the United States west of the Mississippi, opened millions of acres of rich land east of the Mississippi to white settlers. And despite the vastness of the Indian Territory, the government intended the Indian destination would be a more confined area, what later became Oklahoma. Jackson County, 7th president, noted Indian fighter. And you see the statue here last year trying to be taken down by a person who obviously did not agree with his politic. So here you have a larger map. Again, we just particularly saw that as the new technology around making cotton became possible, that this whole area then became open up to an agricultural land base for cotton, and along the edge, rice and then sugar. We see here, all this was the original Indian country and Indian lands. So all of the treaties on this side were violated and broken, and people were sent here to the Trail of Tears. Forced removal. The forced removal of the Cherokee Nation took more than 1,000 miles west of Oklahoma. Some estimates say that 55% of the nation died as a direct result of the Trail of Tears. There was a witness to this. It was in the middle of winter and unusually severe. The snow had frozen hard upon the ground. The river was drifting huge masses of ice. The Indians had their families with them. They brought in their train the wounded and the sick, with children newly born and old men upon the verge of death. They possessed neither tents nor wagons, but only their arms and some provisions. I saw them embark to pass the mighty river, and never will that solemn spectacle fade from my remembrance. No cry, no sob was heard among the assembled crowd. All were silent. Their calamities were of ancient date, and they knew them to be irremediable. The Indians had all stepped into the bark which was to carry them across, but their dogs remained upon the bank. And as soon as these animals perceived that their masters were finally leaving the shore, they set up a dismal howl, and plunging altogether into the icy waters of the Mississippi, they swam after the boat. Democracy in America, and probably everybody here has had to take a test in which you had to know that title, by Alexis de Tocqueville, which we are told is kind of a plaudit to United States democracy. As you can see, this is probably not part of the text that anyone is given in school. Cherokee Nation. We have a perfect and original right to remain without interruption or molestation. The 112 treaties with us and laws of the United States made in pursuance of treaties guarantees our residence and our privileges and secures us against intruders. Our only request is that these treaties be fulfilled and these laws executed. All right, surprise. This is our history. We sentimentalize manifest destiny to our children's peril. Justice Neil Gorsuch, July 9th, 2020. Supreme Court rules that about half of Oklahoma is Native American land. Oh, really? Who knew? So writes the Supreme Court. Today we are asked whether the land these treaties promise remains an Indian reservation for purposes of federal criminal law. Because Congress has not said otherwise, we hold the government to its word. Our history does not go away. We can't simply erase the enslavement of raced Black Americans or raced First People and pretend it does not exist and pretend it does not have consequences. Trickle-down colonialism, as Cherokee and his slave in 1850, there was an expression called the civilized tribes of the tribes of the Cherokee and other tribes in Georgia. And essentially they were trying to become like white people because they knew that was the only way that they could accommodate themselves. All right, I'm going to pause here for just a minute. Take 30 seconds, actually give me about 1 minute. Westward expansion. Louisiana Purchase, 1803. Indian Removal Act, which we just talked about. Lewis and Clark Expedition, still coming up. California, 1848. This is an important book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. She writes, the colonization of North America has been the decisive fact of the modern world. Jefferson was its architect. Andrew Jackson was the implementer of the final solution for the indigenous peoples east of the Mississippi. The expression final solution has a history. We will come to that. Here it is. The Nazis were not the first ones to think in terms of solutions or even final ones. 1869 bill, report to accompany Bill S number 899 about how the public Pacific railroads will settle the Indian, quote, question. They can only be permanently conquered by railroads. The locomotive is the sole solution to the Indian question unless the government changes its systems of warfare and fights the savages the winter through as well as the summer. And it goes on and on and on, but near the end you see in red. As the thorough and final solution of the Indian question, by taking the buffalo range out from under the savage and putting a vast stock and grain farm in its place, the railroads in the Pacific surely are a military necessity. As avenues of sudden approach to Indians on the warpath and of cheap and quick movement of supplies to troops, they're equally a military necessity. So back to Mr. Jefferson. The fledgling American nation relies heavily on New Orleans to both move new goods and sell its own goods. Jefferson feared that over time, France would impose harsh taxes and other restrictions on Americas. So he wants that land. But instead of declaring war with France, he opts to purchase it instead. Uh, why would France sell it? Because their province, Haiti, in the Caribbean, was experiencing the first slave revolt and revolution, successful one in this particular continent. And they were very much interested in moving away from that. But you can also see that what Jefferson is trying to do here is provide a lot of room so that enslavement can move on toward the West. Jefferson, however, is not to be outdone in remarks about other racial types, and he and his friend George Washington, they all think alike in all this. So he writes this from retirement, following his years as a statesman, governor, and president. He was not, however, yet finished his career as a slaver. He had 600 enslaved persons on his death, who were then sold at auction because they were mortgaged to keep Monticello financially up. And actually, some of the enslaved who were sold were his own children. This unfortunate race, whom we have been taking so much pains to save and to civilize, here he's talking about the Indigenous, have by their unexpected desertion and ferocious barbarities justified extermination, and now await our decision on their fates. The Creeks, too, on our southern border, for whom we have done more than any other tribe, have acted the same part, and have already paid their defection with the flower of their warriors. They will probably submit on the condition of removing such new settlements beyond the Mississippi as we shall assign them. Andrew Jackson was not alone in his movement. So westward, the course of empire and enslavement. And the image that you see here is, of course, the standard high school image of the Lewis and Clark expedition with Sacagawea pointing the way. And it was, perhaps we don't know this now, or we're not told about it, but Sacagawea herself was a captive enslaved Indigenous. So from 1803 to 1806, Jefferson authorizes this expedition, hoping that the party would be captured by the Mexican or Spanish so they could get some sense of what their plans were. Again, the Navajo, them too. The Long Walk of the Navajo, 1864, deportation of the Navajo people by the government, forced to walk from the land in what is now Arizona to eastern New Mexico. Some 53 forced marches occurred between August 64 and the end of 1866. So you see here 4 different maps, and 1775, 1850, 1894, 1992. It gives you a general sense. 70% of First Peoples are refugees in their own country. When Europeans first came, there were 12 million First Peoples across the Middle Continent. By the early 20th century, only 250,000 peoples survived. The U.S. carries out an unparalleled genocide that killed 90.6% of the First Peoples. What treaties mean? What we leave you when we take. This is 1883. This was the northern wing of the Northern Pacific Railroad, in which Sitting Bull is invited to be a speaker on this. And you see him here in the center of this. And Sitting Bull's, although he could speak perfectly good English, he spoke in Lakota, and it was to be translated. And this is what he says. I hate all the white people. You are thieves and liars. You have taken away our land and made us outcasts. Of course, the translator translated something else of that. The land grabs. Bob Marley's made popular the Buffalo Soldier, African Americans who served on the Western frontier following the American Civil War. In 1866, 6 all-black cavalry and infantry regiments were created after Congress passed the Army Organization Act. Their main task was to help control the Native Americans on the plains, capture cattle rustlers, thieves, protect settlers, stagecoaches, wagon trains, and railroad crews along the Western Front. Buffalo Soldiers then, in some ways, were doing they're water carrying for the U.S. government against the Indigenous. All colored people that want to go to Kansas, this is 1877, can do so for $505. Now, the point being that Kansas at this particular time was part of the land that had been given to the Indians. The Dawes Act. This is how manifest destiny looks in law, a practical decimation. We make treaties, we put people in places with treaties, and then we sell the land. Between 1887 and 1933, U.S. government policy aimed at assimilating Indians into mainstream American society. The dominant elite that controlled U.S. society saw it as a civilizing mission comparable to the work of European missionaries in Africa. Find lands in the West. Get a home of your own, easy payments, possession within 30 days. Indian lands for sale. Understand, this is land that's already, in theory, owned under reservation and treaties with the Native Americans, as we call them, First People. Okay. In 1888, 1889, the Oklahoma land rush starts at high noon in April 22nd, 1889. 50,000 people were lined up at the starts. You know the expression Oklahoma Sooners? Well, those are the people that started early. These are white settlers going onto Indian land, land that's by treaty. Okay? Millions of acres, Nebraska, the Homestead Act. We'll see Abraham Lincoln here in a minute in the Homestead Act. And then, of course, there's the assimilation in Indian schools. And you saw that the principal, the best known one in Carlisle, boasted that his aim for each child was, quote, to kill the Indian in him and save the man. The image on the bottom right is an image of the indigenous children in the central school, the Phoenix Indian School. And beginning in 1869, for the century that followed, hundreds of thousands of Native American children were placed in boarding schools. Removed from their homes and families, these children were forced to assimilate to American culture with severe punishment for speaking their native languages, engaging in any activity or behavior reflective of their native culture. And you may have just seen in the news that, I have a slide here later, they just, after doing some research and excavated, they found the names of the 125, I think, indigenous children who had been killed in one of these. Burn my heart at Wounded Knee. The slaughter began after the majority of the Sioux had peacefully turned in their firearms. The cavalry began shooting and managed to wipe out the entire encampment. I'm going through a lot of this. We know this story. We know the history of this. 297 Sioux Indians at Wounded Knee, right at the end of the year in 1890. What we would call the final solution in the United States. And after that, the superintendent of the census basically says the frontier is ended. There is no frontier. Frank Baum, Wonderful Wizard of Oz, writes this. With his fall, the nobility, this is on the death of Chief Sitting Bull. Chief Sitting Bull was actually killed in federal custody. He was under police guard when he was shot by one of the attendants. With his fall, the nobility of the redskin is extinguished, and what few are left are a pack of whining curs who lick the hand that smites them. The whites, by law of conquest, by justice and civilization, are masters of the American continent, and the best safety of the frontier settlements will be secured by the total annihilation of the few remaining Indians. Why not an annihilation? Their glory has fled, their spirit broken, their manhood effaced. Better that they die than live the miserable wretches that they are. One could argue that perhaps he is doing a bit of irony, but probably not. Jefferson. If we are constrained to lay the hatchet down against any tribe, we will never lay it down until the tribe is exterminated or driven beyond the Mississippi. Washington, I'll read this again. The immediate objects are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. Roosevelt. I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are the dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of every 10 are. An 1886 speech in New York. And I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th. Lincoln, the Homestead Act in 1862. What did the Homestead Act do? It opened up Oklahoma to white settlers. Pardon me, you say, isn't Oklahoma, wasn't that Indian country? Yeah, yes, exactly. Iconic site is on, this is UKK. Iconic site is on the list of sacred lands that the UN says must be returned to Native Americans. This is part of the lawsuit with 1980 Supreme Court decision where they awarded $6 billion to the Sioux Nation for the violation of this treaty. And the Sioux Nation basically says, we don't want the money, we want our land. But these are the 4 people whose faces are on them, and this is what they said. So a private entrepreneur is putting a different one up. And this is going to be bigger than the Mount Rushmore, and it's Crazy Horse. This is the treaty that was violated. This is the Laramie Treaty in 1863. It formates the basis of the 1980 Supreme Court case, United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians. And this was the land that was given to them, and this was the land that they lost. All these different colors. Lost, 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 lost. Theodore Roosevelt, again, The Winning of the West, Volume 1. Nowadays, we undoubtedly ought to break up the great Indian reservations, disregard the tribal governments, allot the land in severalty, with, however, only a limited power of alienation, and treat the Indians as we do other citizens for certain exceptions for their sake as well as ours. I'm going to pause over here. I want you to see this particular image of Theodore Roosevelt and why finally this particular statue is being removed from the front of the museum in New York. About the black race, he said, until black men stop raping white women, lynching will not stop. That's pretty much a direct quote. It's an astonishing reference, and this was in 1903. He should know better. And we can see what he says about the indigenous. The settler and pioneer have at bottom justice on their side. This great continent could not have been kept as nothing but a game preserve for squalid savages. Moreover, to the most oppressed Indian nations, the whites have often acted as protection, or at least they deferred instead of hastening their fate. Here it is. Researchers identify 102 students who died at a Native American school in Nebraska, operated by the federal government between 1884 and 1934. Helen Hunt Jackson, Century of Dishonor. Some of these titles we may know and we hear about, but I come back to the point, it's astonishing to me that there is not more generalized sense of this whole particular narrative, given that the kind of rethinking of the social environment in which we live. We're going to move now away from narratives that many of us know and talk a little bit about, for the few minutes that remain, I don't think we're going to get through all of this. I want to go from 1493 to 1521 in what we would call the Southwest. I want us to see over here.
And take your time. You don't have to rush through anything. Take your time.
What we're looking over here in the orange, thank you, Robert. What we're looking here in the orange or the yellow, this is what we'd call Nueva España. This would have been, at one point, all of the Spanish claimed properties in the New World. They started here, and they moved in 1521 into the conquer of Teotihuacan in Mexico. And at one particular point in 1526, San Miguel de Guadalupe, South Carolina, this was the first actual Spanish colony in the New World with black enslaved persons from Africa, not on the East Coast. It would in 1526 here. 1821, Mexican independence. And just to show you here where some of the lands are. So this is then the United States at this particular point, 1801. This is what Jefferson is going to eventually buy for about 10 cents an acre. This land over here, you're going to see with Texas. The Taino, of course, and other indigenous persons misnamed by Columbus as Indians. And in 1492, they were among the first to welcome Columbus. These are images done by a Spanish Benedictine who was along, Franciscan, excuse me, and he's basically describing the atrocities. He later goes back to the Spanish crown with these images and says, basically, you need to stop these people. Within 60 years after Columbus landed, only a few hundred of what may have been 250,000 Taino remained. Yes. You see they sick dogs on them. Columbus, not unlike a later European colonists, would cut off the hands or arms of the persons when they weren't giving them the gold that he was looking for. Okay. 1519 to 1521, Hernan Cortez arrives at Tehuacán on 8 November. The city's population had been estimated between 200,000 and 400,000, one of the largest cities in the world. Yeah. An important text, if you walk away with anything, indigenous people are the original test subjects for enslavement. Resendez explains that one of the reasons enslavement of indigenous people has been less understood is that it was illegal, operated in the shadows of the well-studied enslavement of Africans and African descent people. Okay. In the red, 1865, 1866, Southern states enacted the infamous Black Codes aimed at restricting the freedom of former slaves. Adopting tried and true tactics such as vagrancy laws, convict leasing, debts, white Southerners sought to nullify provisions of the 13th Amendment. Okay. The tactics he lists were pulled from the playbook that had kept Indians in servitude in the West and in Mexico long after slavery had been made illegal. I would refer this particular text because I can't do anything near justice to any of this particular topic here, except to note that. As a Catholic, I can talk to you a little bit about Juniper Rosero, who was made a saint in 2016. Formed the first mission in 1769 in San Diego that then became 13 or 14 later particular missions. What he did and what the Franciscans did to the indigene, and again, this is a longer issue than we have here. By 1834, only 20,000 out of 800,000 remained in the missions. There are some historians who basically call them concentration camps. And U.S. occupation and settlement exterminated more than 100,000 California Native people in 25 years, reducing the population to 30,000. Policy began in 1769 with Juniper Rosero, with the founding of the first mission. Their children were tied to their mothers. The next thing we saw, some terrible things. Some of the runaway men were tied with sticks, beaten with straps. One chief was taken out to the open field, and a young calf, which had just been dyed, was skinned, and the chief was sewed into the skin while it was yet warm. He was kept tied to a stake all day, but he died soon, and they kept his corpse tied up. It's unpleasant to read it. I'm sure it's unpleasant to listen to it. It's more unpleasant to go to these missions and look into the courtyard and see where they have the flogging pole. So coming to, I walk through a narrative, and I walk through it fairly quickly. There are good texts that can be read on this, and I'm assuming that anyone who is here, who is listening, has an interest in recovery of a certain history. My original questions are about narrative. I can't do justice to the dead. I cannot do justice to the people. I can talk about perhaps the uses of the narrative. And by that I mean, we think what I would call the original narrative. We talk about, again, the colonies and the New World, and just the expression of the New World, and settler colonialism. What are Indians for? What is the weight of ink? What then does the popular US historical narrative of a natural westward movement persist? The answer is that those who still hold the narrative remain captives of an ideology of manifest destiny. A point I made earlier. It's like when someone says, oh, well, it's common knowledge that, or everyone knows this. Usually when there's that kind of rhetorical cheerleading, when someone has to say, well, it's destiny that's manifest, that seems a little overdetermined expression. But according to this, the United States expanded across the continent to assume its preordained size and shape. In the third or fourth of these particular series, I talked about the enslavement and the US economy. North and South made their money on the buying, selling, and breeding of black bodies. Mortgage, insurance, and as I've said on a couple of different occasions, we know their names not because we find them in churches and synagogues and in cemeteries, because they were just dumped. We know their names because they became bills of sale, they were on insurance claims, they were on mortgage claims. That's how we know the names of these persons. So the ideology normalizes the successive invasions and occupations of indigenous nations, and Mexico as not being colonist or imperialist, but rather simply ordained progress. So that in this view, Mexico itself, here, okay, in the Mexican War, the settlers from the white settlers, the Europeans, that would come into Texas, and they want to bring their enslaved into Texas. The Mexican government forbids it. But so 10 years later, in 1846, this republic goes to war against Mexico, becomes part of this country here. So we have it from the halls of Tripoli to from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. We have that, you hear that expression, particularly in kind of a military song, and this is what they're talking about. They're talking about the Mexican War. The early image, again, a map of what would have been the Spanish area and territory, and why this is important, because already this is a well-funded, well-lived, well-enslaved politic. Spain is already bringing black African kidnapped persons into this particular country in what we now call the Carolinas. You can see this first map of Texas after it became a republic. It's about half of Mexico. So Mexico couldn't pay its debt, and so we extorted about half their country from them. And the agreement, and I'm going to be doing this in a different thing, the Mexican and Indian persons who lived there were promised land, and they were promised citizenship, neither of which they got. Most European and North American have their first history lessons through media and have not been subject to standards set by peer reviews, university presses, from the 1950s to the 1960s. America learned more about the history of colonial America from movies in Hollywood. Before and after Hollywood's long commitment to the history of cowboys and pioneers, comic book rather than textbook, country songs full of chronological tables fill the gaps left by Westerns. Then, as now, American children and quite a few young males learned to thematize parts of that history by playing cowboys and Indians. And here we have the good Sub-Lieutenant Letanto, always the access to the white person. Okay. Buffalo Bill's Wild West, Congress of Rough Riders. Okay. How to take a captive people and further humiliate them. Narrative of the past conforms to a present. So a way a settler colonial state manages its movement is by having a narrative like Manifest Destiny, through the circulation of a creation story. The creation story that we have. The West is from racially homogenous, romantically empty. One of the things I ask my students to do is go to the museum, the National Museum, go to the American Wing, look at the American art, and look. Ask yourself, you see those American landscapes? You see a buffalo or two. You see an Indian, quote, on a horse, probably off on a mountain someplace. The land is empty. So what functions do these images serve? They're noble, but they're savage Indians. This is the language out of where did we get noble savage? We get savage out of the Declaration of Independence. In this way, white supremacy takes the form of preservation of a space that was conducive to the recreation of ideals of Anglo-American whiteness against the forces of corruption of immigrants. It bolsters the idea that Native people posed no serious threat to white society due to their supposed weakness, except, of course, in the Declaration of Independence. The last of the Mohicans. If you have children, you take them to the library and this rack upon rack upon rack out of these classic American novels. And again, I'm speaking as an American Studies major with a PhD in the topic. From Duke University, none of this was ever mentioned to me at the time. Cooper devises a fictional counterpoint of celebration to the dark underbelly of the new America, usually the U.S. American race, and new people born on the merger. We're going to hear this. Cooper has the last of the, quote, noble and pure natives die off as nature would have it, with the last Mohican handing the captive over to Hawkeye, the nativized settler, as his adopted son. It's a convenient fantasy, except that it continues to stay. The early whitening of the rhetoric. You know, letters from an American farmer. By the way, Crèvecoeur was not American, he was French. But again, this is one of the classic formative texts that we were given. Whence come all these people? They are a mixture of English and Scot and Irish and French and Dutch and Germans and Swedes. This is in 1782. At that particular time, there was almost 700,000, 800,000 black colonial enslaved persons. From this promiscuous breed, that race now called Americans have arisen. What then is the American, this new man? He's either a European or the descendant of a European. Hence that strange mixture of blood, which you will find in no other country. And by the way, one kind of wonders why people react the way we do when we hear talking about woke culture or keeping some cultures silent, or we think that the first bill of nationalization in the United States in 1790 limited citizenship and immigration to free white persons of good standing. And that's the text. You can read it just yourself. We didn't just invent white last week. I mean, this has been something that's been part of every particular document in the United States. And while we might now use a language of diversity and use a language of inclusion, this was certainly not the original meaning or intention of this particular country. And as you can see, Thomas Paine, Common Sense, 1775. Europe and not England is the parent country of America. This new world hath been the asylum for the persecuted lovers of civil and religious liberty for every part of Europe. Well, and this is not the time to talk about this, but as a matter of fact, part of the issue around the new country and what I would call the compromise constitution is, what do we do with all these persons who are now enslaved here and who then also feel themselves as due civil and religious liberty? So in 1893, 3 years after the atrocity at Wounded Knee and the murder of Sitting Bull, he was in captive. He was being held captive by federal reservation police, and he's killed by one of them. The superintendent of the census announced that the western frontier was closed. Frederick Jackson Turner, a young professor, writes that the thesis that the conquest of the Western Foundation frontier had given America and American society its special character. And to this particular point, I mean, I was myself just finishing graduate school at that particular time, and so we studied the significance of frontier and American history at great length. Never in any part of those conversations did any of what I'm talking about here come up. Western expansion, he says, accounts for America's optimism, their rugged independence, and their stress on adaptability, ingenuity, and self-reliance. Well, all right. What are Indians for? Well, they seem, from this in New England, there's a kind of prurience in a lot of this, and I did this before in my presentation on Rise and enslaved resistance, and being able to look at how the people we have enslaved or the people that we have exterminated have resisted us there's a kind of voyeurism to that. There's a kind of, I don't want to use the expression eroticism, but there's a certain power dynamic that, and you can kind of see it even in particular here, where there's gender narratives and there's power dynamics through in all of this. So what are Indians for? Indians are for pushing forward a certain kind of doctrine of supremacy, of certainly. Delaware leader. They do what they please. They enslave those who are not their color, although created by the same great spirit who created us. They would make slaves of us if they could, but they cannot do it. They kill us, or they'll ship us to Barbados. There's no faith to be plus in their words. John Wayne. I don't feel we did wrong in taking this great country away from them. There are great numbers of people who needed new land, and the Indians were selfishly trying to keep it for themselves. Okay, we're going to have a birthday party for my little sister. What are Indians for? An elegy. Narrative as an excuse, an occasion, a justification of settler colonialism. Here you see a couple different things. We saw that image before. This was the image of Manifest Destiny here, 1848, where you have a largely white angel with a couple empty sheep and maybe one or two buffalo moving off into the dark, and the light is coming along with them. Okay. And you have this kind of this virgin land that when they use that language, it is gendered, and you can kind of look at the image that they use for it, which itself is, I won't say a power dynamic, but that European explorers and invaders discovered an inhabited land. It was not pristine wilderness necessarily. It would possibly still be so today, because neither the technology nor the social organization of Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries had the capacity to maintain it, of course. They did not settle a virgin land. They invaded and displaced a resident population. This is so simple a fact that it seems self-evident. We go back to Amherst and to Washington and to Jefferson and to Roosevelt. We hear these things and then we forget them. We go, well, no but. And when you start listing all of this, I'm not discounting the other enslaved narrative that we know, but this is a particular narrative that needs to be retold. So what are Indians for? Shopping mythology. This is the owner of the Redskins over on the side, and maybe if nothing else, we learn tonight where the expression redskin comes from. It's not a compliment. So why do we name our battles and weapons after people we have vanquished? The conquered tribes of this land were not rivals, but victims, cheated and possibly outgunned. The destruction of the Indians, as quote, was asymmetric warfare, compounded by deviousness in the name of imperialist manifest destiny. White America shot, imprisoned, lied, swindled, preached, bought, built, and voted its way to domination, which we still do. And you can see this, you can pick up the mechanics and politics around voters. Identifying our powerful weapons and victorious campaigns with those who subjugated serves to lighten the burden of our guilt. It confuses violation with a fair fight. Seven years after Kennedy's nomination, Slotkin reminds his readers, American troops would be describing Vietnam as Indian country, search and destroy missions as a game of cowboys and Indians. Kennedy's ambassador to Vietnam would justify a massive military escalation by citing the necessity of moving the Indians away from the fort so that the settlers could plant corn. So it is the rhetoric that stays. Codename Geronimo, the hunt for Osama bin Laden. Did we know this? In some ways, Geronimo is much like Mahatma Gandhi in Arizona, and we have taken his name and his energy and his politic and his crusade, really, and turned it against him. Within days of the assassination of Osama bin Laden in 2010, it was revealed that the Navy SEAL team executing the mission had used the codename Geronimo for its target. As an incentive to recruit fighters, colonial authorities introduced a scalp hunting program that became a permanent and long-lasting element of settler warfare against indigenous nations. Male scalps, female scalps, children's scalps. Again, Amherst. Could it not be contrived? In the current usage, the term Indian country is used by soldiers, military strategists, reporters, World Wide Web users to refer to hostile, unsecured, dangerous territory in Iraq and Afghanistan. It still means behind enemy lines. Geronimo is dead. May 2010. Blessing Lakota. So the Columbian Exchange is what was called what happened in the old world, quote, and the new world, and what happened between North America and Europe, what came to Europe, Africa, and Asia, what returned. What is not, and so what you see peanuts and peppers and beans and corn and cocoa and tomato. You see bananas and citrus and fruits. You see grains and grapes. You see diseases. You see olives and onions. What is not mentioned? The erasure of a people, peoples, up and down. My friend Karl Marx in Das Kapital. The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of their aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signaled the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. All right, Robert, I'm going to end by acknowledging the first colonized peoples. And I want to come back to this first particular map of the Virginia land, 1612. And the item in red was a commentary on it in a map book. His masterpiece map of Virginia, published in 1612, remained in active use for 7 decades and opened this part of North America to European exploration, settlement, and trade. This is how we scrub a history. We think we know the history, but we don't. What's not mentioned? The life, the land theft, the dead who remain as our history, the ghosts who do not nor cannot rest in peace. We're opening the land to European exploration and settlement and trade. Unfortunately, the land was already a home for exploration and settlement and trade. Back to King George. The global indigenous cause reaches a major milestone in 2007 when the UN General Assembly passed the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Not surprisingly, only 4 members of the Assembly voted in opposition, all of them Anglo-settler states, the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. Again, on this, the week of Thanksgiving, I thank everyone who joined me for part of this. There's a number of very good bibliographical references that I can give to persons, and any mistakes that I made here are, of course, mine. And there's a lot of information that goes through. I would be very happy to have conversations with anyone who would like to know how to start doing your own particular reclamation of your own particular history. And thank you, and assalamu alaikum, peace to everyone. And Robert, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Ed. Greatly appreciate that. As always, that was excellent. Just as a reminder, this has been a multi-part series of programs that Edward has been kind enough to share his time and knowledge with us. I've pasted the links to the prior programs in the comment section in Facebook and the chat section in Zoom. I'll also email those out to everyone that registered for the live programs. We did have a few questions come in. If someone does have a question for Edward, he'll answer as many as he can. Feel free to type those in the Q&A or the chat in Zoom or the comment section on Facebook. And so, Edward, of course, we did get a few questions already. Let me send some of these over and see what you think. We got a question from Jennifer, she asked, is the treatment of Indigenous people in the United States been different than that in Canada and Mexico?
Yes, Canada has made it part of their politic. That's why I started off with that first slide. They have what they call First Nations, and is very much they are now in their own particular way of negotiating reparative restorative justice in Canada for what they call the First Peoples of the First Nations.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you. And Christine asked, why is Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill? Well, he's going away. They're going to replace him with Harriet Tubman, although
No,
that's a years-long process that's
as
not
my
going to be
point
happening
about
anytime
putting,
soon.
and we would put Harriet Tubman on a $20 bill. Why? This is a woman who basically gave her life to rescue people from being commodities. That doesn't make no sense to me. Anyway,
Mhm.
but exactly why is Andrew Jackson on? Why is Andrew Jackson? Why does Woodrow Wilson have a bridge that ends up in the unmarked enslaved pit in Virginia? There's lots of things like this.
The kind of the reputation or the legacy of Andrew Jackson is really fascinating when you consider for the longest time he was really considered one of our greatest presidents, and it's only been in recent years that people have kind of reevaluated the whole administration and some of the things he did. So interesting in that
Well,
regard.
I hope I'm helping reevaluate that.
I think you are. I think you are. Let's see. Here's a question from Kelly. And before Edward, I let you answer it, I'll chime in with my own thoughts. So Kelly asked, why wasn't there more resistance from Indigenous people in the early days? And I think just human nature is when there's two sides conflicting, that we're apt to say, why did the side that came out on the losing end, so to speak, resist more? Why the same question people ask about the Jews and the Holocaust, or in European countries against the Nazis, or all different types of things like that. African Americans and slavery. So that's, I guess my overall answer is just that's kind of human nature for people to think, why didn't they resist more? When in fact they resisted a lot.
They
They just got.
resisted. Actually, Robert, the thing is that we pay no attention to the resistance. And I think that
Mhm.
an indigenous people's history of the United States is a very significant particular book. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. It's a paperback book. You can probably get a copy of it online. You can have it to your house tomorrow. Uh, we don't know these texts because we don't read them.
Yeah,
They,
don't you think part of that is, there's that saying, the victors write the history. So we,
it's
and so
absolutely.
a lot of that.
There was a great deal of resistance, and part of what I have been trying to do is again to rewrite, to unwhiten the narrative, and starting with Manifest Destiny.
Yeah, it seems like the narrative is, oh, the Indians were very welcoming, and hey, let's have Thanksgiving together and kumbaya and all that stuff, which actually, yeah, that part of the story is a little revisionist. But yeah, there was actually quite a bit of resistance. It doesn't seem like that's really been, talked about because of the whole victors, right? The history thing, so to speak. What about, you have another program coming up? It's not on our calendar just yet, but would you be able to share a little bit of information on that? A
I have,
sneak preview, so to speak.
I have a lot of, which ones are we referring to? I have a lot of programs
Oh, the
coming up.
next Enslaved one, the next one in the Enslaved series.
There's a couple that are more than I'm working on the enslaved series, and one of which is going to be simply on how they lived, how from the years 1862 to 1866, 1870, how the freedmen, as they were then, how they lived, what kinds of life did they particularly have. I'm doing work here for you on the 5th, and I'm going to talk about basically a reparations call out, in which I'm simply looking at 3 or 4 different, including Tulsa, Roseville, and Evanston, about how reparative justice programs are in place. To I want the last part of this particular series was about Southwest and Mexico and the mission area. So that's going to be in January and February.
Yes, I've lived in Southern California for 5 years, and so my ears perked up, and especially when you were talking about the missions and the history there. As someone
Well,
who grew up in the
Robert, when they
Midwest, you don't
call
really
them,
hear that story.
you,
What's that?
they call them concentration camps. Uh, there are a number of historians who actually use that expression.
Oh yeah, I guess my point was growing up in the Midwest and attending a very good public school system and attending a very good university. Just you don't hear about that kind of the history of that part of the United States all that much, at least in my opinion. So it's really interesting to hear you give your perspectives on that. And I'm glad you included that because I do think that we kind of tend to maybe be a little bit more biased towards things that have happened on the East Coast or the Midwest and kind of forget about, the Texas history and Southern
Well,
California and places like that.
the Southwest enslaved and the Indigenous are the next two that I will be doing in this particular series. Yes.
Oh, okay, excellent. This isn't a question, but a comment from Mina. She says many court cases from First Nations versus government are currently taking place in the Canadian courts. So thank you for that.
That's true.
Let's see what else we have.
And again, but they have that ability because they were placed into a legal context by George III. Uh, that should be significant because the United States, we did not do that. The British did that.
Mhm. Yeah, really. I wish I had a recording of it, but I was an art history major in college, and one of the professors talked about the portrayal of Indigenous peoples in American art, so to speak. It was interesting because you mentioned some of the exact, terminologies, the how these people were portrayed. So that was really fascinating as well. So I appreciate you including that information. For those that joined us late, this program is being recorded. So if you did join us late, or if you want to watch this again, I'll send out the recording link. Probably not tonight. It probably won't be till tomorrow, but we'll see how things go. But it definitely will be out there at some point in time in the near future. And I think that's all from this end. Edward, anything else that you wanted to add from your end?
Keep doing the good work, all of us. Keep reading, keep reading,
Okay.
keep reading. If
Well,
they
thank
tell
you.
you
You're
not,
you're
if they tell you
you're
not
the
to read
ones
it,
doing a lot of the heavy lifting, getting us educated on these
if
subjects.
they
So
tell you don't pay attention to it, pay attention to it.
okay, excellent. Well, thanks for your advice. So okay, everyone. Well, great. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Have a safe weekend, and we will see you all next time. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Good
Bye.
Thanksgiving, everyone.
Thanks, Edward.
Thank you, Robert.